Welcome to the AI Policy Podcast, a podcast by the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at CSIS. I'm Gregory C. Allen.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz.
Join us as we dive into the world of AI policy, where we'll discuss the implications of this transformative technology for national security, geopolitics, and global governance.
We're back for the AI Policy Podcast, which is my favorite new CSIS podcast, as many of our listeners know. Here with Gregory C. Allen, colleague and the head of our Wadhwani Center. Greg, great to be with you again. We got a lot to talk about today. Let's first talk about AI policy outcomes at the G7 summit. I thought going into this G7 that AI might get pushed to the side because there was so much going on with Ukraine, so much going on with Israel and Gaza. But AI still managed to, make some headway there, didn't it?
Well, it's still the transformative technology of our time, and it's still something that the G7 has distinguished itself as a relevant actor. Most people do not go to the G7, at least 5 years ago, for important technology policy outcomes. But when it comes to AI, a lot of the most important stuff that's been happening in international diplomacy has been happening at the G7, and this Leaders Summit was no exception.
Tell me, who took part in the discussion? We know the countries, but what do we know about the policy outcomes from this session?
The first thing to understand is that this is the Leaders Summit, and for folks who don't understand how the G7 works, there are ministerial meetings, which is, where ministers or secretaries of departments and agencies from various countries will get together on a subject matter basis, and then that kind of culminates in the Leaders Summit, where some of the stuff that was worked on at the ministerial level is now ready for the more high-level discussion. And AI has already featured in the digital technology industry ministerial, as well as the foreign policy ministerial, as well as the finance minister's ministerial. So AI has already been a big part of this G7 year. But here at the Leaders Summit, there were some important things that they wanted to get done. The first of which is that they were elevating some of the stuff that had been done previously when it comes to AI regulation and interoperability. So for folks who have been following this podcast, they know that this has been one of the important outcomes of the G7 in the past, and that's something that they doubled down on previously. Interoperability means we're not going to have identical regulations, but we're going to make sure that our regulatory systems can talk to each other with stuff like common systems of standards, common definitions of key terms. All of that has been taken to the next level here. And in particular, the Hiroshima AI process, the thing that was the critical outcome from last year's Japanese G7 year on AI, which deals with what is the obligations of key organizations that are developing advanced general purpose AI systems. Well, this year, the G7 has pledged to come up with new monitoring and implementation mechanisms for that Hiroshima AI process, which means that this might go from a voluntary code of conduct where companies just let you know that they're doing it to now actually you can go to the OECD or you can go to some other international institution and be sort of officially certified in the Hiroshima AI process code of conduct. That's a really important next step for international AI governance.
After all, though, this is G7, it's 7 countries. There's a lot of countries in the world that are experimenting with AI. In fact, our colleagues, our CEO, John Hamre, and Victor Cha, our Korea chair, came out with a paper just last week that talks about how the G7 needs to be reformed and expanded, particularly expanded to include Australia and South Korea. If this is 7 countries at this point, why does it matter so much?
That's a great question, and it gets to why the G7 is having such a special moment, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine has broken so many of the other critical international institutions where this type of work would have been done previously. The G20, for example, had been a really critical institution in the mid-2000s and 2010s, and suddenly there's a lot of conversations, such as when AI regulation intersects with political values of democracy, where it's really not appropriate to have Russia and China in the room because they don't share the same values as the leading democracies of the world. And so the G7 leaders are trying to find ways to be inclusive for the countries that they want to work with. And in this case, that included inviting a really interesting group of countries: Egypt, Kenya, Algeria, and Italy has been particularly interested in African outreach for this entire G7, as well as India, which is this year's leader of the Global Partnership on AI, another international institution, Brazil, which leads the G20 this year, and finally Turkey, which is an interesting bridge to the Middle East, but also Europe. So there's an interesting group of countries that they brought in, and guess who else was brought in? The Pope.
That's right. The Pope was there.
Yes, and so this is something that Prime Minister Meloni of Italy had promised us to do a long time ago. The Vatican, and Pope Francis in particular, has really sought to position itself as a leader on the ethical and moral issues of AI. For my part, I think that a lot of those debates were already had in 2019, and now we're really ready to move to more of an implementation, regulation, and governance part of the conversation. But given the current state of Italian domestic politics, they're not going to pass up on an opportunity to put the Pope in front of a global audience and have that opportunity. He not only echoed his sentiments in the previously mentioned Rome call for AI ethics, which has been around for a few years, secured a few new corporate signatories over the course of the G7 year, although not any additional G7 government ministries. And there was also a bilateral conversation between Pope Francis and President Biden, which I'm sure AI came up in that conversation.
So in your mind, what was accomplished here, and did they really get to the broader AI agenda?
Well, one thing they did is give themselves more time. It used to be the case that the G7 really was these ministerial meetings and the leader summit, and then there might be, 6 months of not much happen. But the Japanese G7 presidency set sort of a new precedent in terms of G7 all year, substantive work being done all year. And so now the Leader Summit has endorsed the G7 working with the OECD to come up with implementation and monitoring mechanisms for this Hiroshima AI process code of conduct. That might be what ultimately becomes the real regulatory standard for general purpose AI systems, both in the European Union, where it will be compulsory, and in other countries like Japan and the United States, where it might be more voluntary.
So after this summit, Greg, how do the ministers that are involved in this, how do they keep working on this issue?
Well, one thing that came up that I thought was really interesting was on the AI and labor issue. So Prime Minister Maloney has previously expressed concerns that if AI keeps making technological progress at its current clip, it's going to put a lot of people out of work. It's going to really change what we need from our education system. It's going to change the finance of these countries.
And we're worried about this in this country too, obviously.
And so now the G7 is on the hook. The labor ministerial meeting, which has not happened yet, is on the hook for coming up with an action plan for AI and the future of work. And you might say that, hey, it's the G7, who really cares what they think on this topic? But I do think it's the big first substantive international institution putting its stamp on AI and the future of work. You've seen some reports come out of places like consulting firms like McKinsey or like the World Economic Forum, which is mostly a CEO's club. But this will be the first time that you have a group of countries coming together and saying, hey, if this happens, here's how we're going to need to rejigger our governments. And I think that's interesting in and of itself.
Okay. Well, we're going to keep watching that, and I'm going to keep asking you about that because I found it to be absolutely fascinating process. And the fact that countries are finding time to talk about this and really finding a lot of time to talk about this matters. Let's move on to probably my favorite story involving AI policy in the last couple of weeks, and that's Apple and OpenAI's announcing of a partnership. I love this for all sorts of reasons, Greg, but one of my favorite things was seeing Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, sitting at the Apple conference with his little tag around his neck, just like everybody else. Wasn't even in the front row, I think. He was kind of like a few rows back, and he just looked like a regular, Apple employee or convention guy, but after all, he's pretty revolutionary. And
he's a pretty important guy.
He's a pretty important guy, and this could be a pretty revolutionary, should I say, partnership?
There's some really interesting things here. So on the one hand, stuff like ChatGPT is already available on the iPhone as an app or as something you can access through your browser.
Yep.
What's so interesting here is within this partnership between OpenAI and Apple, it's going to be built into a lot of the core functionality of Apple's offerings through the iPhone, through the iOS system, through MacBook. And if you've ever had this realization that on the one hand, your calendar is already pretty great being digitized. You can send invites to other people, you can cancel, you can reschedule, and all of this is electronic and automated, and to anybody in the 1950s would be a miracle. But if you ever just wanted to talk to your calendar and be like, do I have any openings on this time, or find me a good time to do that, that actually has been the subject of 20 different AI startups. And it's never actually been, technologically mature. The AI assistant always stinks and can't really make it work. But now you've got Apple sort of saying that they have been a part of so many different revolutions in user interfaces, whether it's the original graphical user interface that was popularized by the first Macintosh computer, whether it's the touchscreen interface that was popularized by the first iPhone, and now AI, large language models, as an interface between the user and the computer. I think this is a really important step forward and a sign that Apple's AI plans have really matured and they're looking to do something serious with it.
I've been thinking about it like that a bit too, in that Apple is the master of design. It's the master of teaching us how to do new and interesting things that really become part of our lives, if not part of our actual appendage. I mean, do you know anybody who doesn't have their phone like right with them wherever they are pretty much 24 hours a day?
Yeah.
Everybody I know is like, my sons practically sleep with their iPhone. This feels like this could be a pretty big moment.
Yeah, and I think it's also a big moment for the competitive dynamics of the industry. Because Apple has folks inside the company who are AI experts. Some really big names in the AI sector have either work at Apple right now or have passed through Apple after doing some important work there. And the question is the competitive landscape for iOS and iPhone with AI going to look like that of search, where there's one company, Google, that has a really important partnership and is the primary beneficiary of that relationship? Or is Apple going to have multiple partners? Are they going to work with ChatGPT and Google and Anthropic or other companies? Are they going to do more stuff in-house? And one thing that we've heard is that Apple is going to have a lot of the training data in order to refine the models that it gets from some of the big providers so that there will be stuff that's a little bit more Apple customized. But this is a really important competitive landscape. We had heard last year that Sam Altman was talking with Johnny Ive, who no longer works at Apple.
Right, the famous designer.
Exactly, about creating a new AI hardware system. And this partnership doesn't necessarily prove that those plans for an AI-specific device are off. But if I was Tim Cook and I was looking at Sam Altman talking to Johnny Ive, I'd be doing exactly what happened here, which is trying to find a way to partner instead of compete with.
Right, and if I was anyone looking at Sam Altman talking to Johnny Ive, I'd be like, okay, something big is going to happen next.
Exactly.
Okay, so what does this do to OpenAI's other partnerships? They have partnerships with many other companies, Microsoft included. What else is this?
Exactly. So Microsoft is a key investor. I think it's the largest single shareholder, certainly largest dollar investor, if not largest shareholder in OpenAI. But after the Department of Justice said that it would look into whether or not this was an antitrust issue, the nature of the partnership between OpenAI and Microsoft, both companies have really been taking steps to emphasize that while this is a strategic partnership, while it is a very valuable strategic partnership, they're going to do things that don't always involve each other. And I think OpenAI now working with Apple, who for many, many decades has been a fierce competitor of Microsoft, sort of highlights that OpenAI does have some serious independence. And at the same time, Microsoft in its cloud platform, Azure, and through its Office 365 suite of applications, has also been trying to point out that you don't always have to use OpenAI's offerings. They're going to be a platform who makes it possible for you to work with multiple AI companies. So I think that's interesting in terms of the next steps of the antitrust policy debate.
So there's people who always see these things and they think, right away their danger signals go off. Okay, Apple, OpenAI, that sounds really big and scary. What do policymakers need to do in looking at this partnership?
One thing I think that's kind of interesting is that when you integrate AI with the iOS, some of the most amazing next steps in terms of performance also raise new issues around, for example, privacy. So this doesn't relate specifically to the iOS partnership. But recently, Microsoft was talking about a new AI system that would just take pictures of your desktop and all the windows that you have open in your operating system so that could be used as AI training data. Because if you want the AI to sort of be driving your computer alongside you in a conversational way, well, it needs to be looking at what you're looking at in the computer. And immediately, Microsoft got some criticism from folks who talked about that as a cybersecurity vulnerability, as a privacy risk, et cetera, et cetera. From my perspective, I'm not sure it's actually all that different from just how, Windows uses your data exactly right now. But the basic point is that these debates are now going to move towards the next step in AI evolution as the AI's relationship with the user gets ever more intimate and involved in so many different parts of the activity. There's one other thing I want to point out here that I thought was pretty interesting. which is that Elon Musk weighed in, basically saying that this partnership was terrible. And he said that for the folks who work for his companies, which is SpaceX, Tesla, and X, formerly Twitter, if people are using Apple devices with OpenAI at the OS level, he was going to have to ban Apple devices because of the security risk to his companies.
Okay, talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Well, it couldn't possibly have anything to do with the fact that X is trying to create a competing AI system to what ChatGPT is creating, or the fact that he recently sued OpenAI after his really acrimonious departure from the firm a long time ago.
Because he was one of the initial investors.
Exactly. At one point in discussions, he even become the CEO at one point.
Right. So no discussion about this is complete without Elon Musk weighing in, I guess.
He really is not comfortable seeing an AI debate that he's not part of. One final thing that we should just mention that's a little bit off topic, but I do think is interesting related to OpenAI, is that they just added General retired Paul Nakasone, the former head of the NSA, to their board of directors.
Very well known to CSI. Has been here many times, worked with us on countless things.
Yes, and so he was the former head of the U.S. National Security Agency, which plays an absolutely critical role in all things cybersecurity, cyber defense, cyber intelligence, and also the head of U.S. Cyber Command in the Department of Defense in a dual-hatted role. So in terms of OpenAI's linkages to the U.S. national security community, I mean, they could probably already get any meeting that they wanted, but now they really have a very well-respected elder statesman who is at the table and able to give them that perspective, which I thought was a really interesting decision.
That is interesting. We'll keep watching that and talking about that. But in the meantime, another really interesting story, and this is right in your wheelhouse, Greg. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia's investment in a leading Chinese AI company. On May 31st, news outlets reported that Saudi Aramco, the oil company, that their venture capital arm, Prosperity 7, took part in an investment round for the Chinese startup Zhipu AI. What's this all about? What does this mean for us? And does this represent like a groundbreaking moment in China-Saudi Arabia relationship?
So there's a few things that I think are worth bringing in to contextualize this story. Number one, the U.S. investor community has really exited China's tech scene over the past few years. And that's been true for multiple reasons, from the degree of volatility in decision-making that the Chinese central government showed in its response to COVID, keeping zero COVID as the policy for much longer than made any kind of rational sense, as well as the crackdown on tech entrepreneurs in China, right? Forcing Jack Ma, one of the most celebrated tech entrepreneurs in China, to basically flee the country. He now lives in Japan.
Yeah, none of that was priced in.
Exactly, right? So there's been a real scaring moment. And then finally, of course, something we've talked about many times is the geopolitical relations between the United States and China and how that's playing out in tech and AI. So for a lot of reasons, venture capital investment from the West into China has really gone down. Well, in steps Saudi Arabia, which, as everyone knows, has a lot of money and is interested in diversifying its economy away from oil and energy. And so stuff like tech, AI, data centers, which are very energy intensive, look interesting as a next market.
And maybe they don't want to be so dependent on us either.
Well, that's certainly a statement that they could be making with this deal. And I think you're right to bring that up, because when I saw this deal, my mind immediately harkened back to the deal between the United States in the form of Microsoft and the UAE in the form of G42. So the US is cutting deals with the United Arab Emirates for AI and cloud and future. And immediately China's thinking, okay, how can we also bring an offer? Now, China has some serious disadvantages in this regard. Number one, is this Saudi company, is this Chinese company operating in Saudi Arabia, are they going to be able to get access to the most advanced semiconductor chips? And right now, Saudi Arabia is allowed to buy the most advanced chips, according to the current export controls. But if you're working directly with a Chinese firm, if those chips are for a Chinese firm, if that Chinese firm has ties to the Chinese national security community, the U.S. Department of Commerce could have grounds to deny those exports. And so I'm sure those are exactly the kinds of conversations that they're having at the Department of Commerce and the White House National Security Council in the wake of this deal.
Greg, same week that Prosperity 7 investment was announced, Xi Jinping met heads of state from the Middle East for the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum in Beijing. You've already talked about this a little bit, but what do you make of China's diplomatic push into the region? Is this again about the United States?
For me, the reason why I think these two things are connected is that you're seeing that AI is now one of the key movements in international politics.
Yeah.
when China is having its strategy overhauled for its entire Middle Eastern relations, there's a big AI component to that. And so I think in the same way that folks are familiar with the geopolitics of oil or the geopolitics of energy, we're now seeing this maturing era of the geopolitics of AI.
Really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And so the fact that these things happen back to back, I think that's no accident.
That is a fascinating note. And I think we're going to need to continue to talk about the geopolitics of AI on this very AI policy podcast. Greg, thanks as always.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for show notes and our research reports. This podcast was produced by David Lotfi, Isaac Goldston, Isabel Burns, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.